Hello everyone, and welcome back to my What If series. Today I want to talk about what would happen if Peeta had died during the 74th Hunger Games and Katniss was the sole victor. The reason I started thinking about this at all is because of the new Divergent book series that's been announced that are apparently set in an alternative universe. Veronica Roth described the books as an alternative universe version rather than a spin-off or a sequel, and is going to be called The Sixth Faction. And immediately I thought, what's the Hunger Games version of this? Because one of the most interesting things to me about an alternative universe version of a story is not just changing a detail for fun, but asking what happens when you remove one of the key emotional or structural pillars that the entire story depends on. And for the Hunger Games, one of the biggest possible changes is this. What if Katniss had won the 74th Hunger Games on her own? Not with Peeta. Not as part of the Capitol surviving star-crossed lovers narrative, not with a dual victor ending, just Katniss on her own. And for this version, I think the most likely way that happens is probably with Peeta dying from his leg wound. In the original story, Peeta is already badly injured by Cato, and without the rule change, without the same level of urgency to preserve him, or if the medicine didn't arrive in time, it's very, very easy to imagine that that wound ends up killing him before the finale. And I think that this really changes everything, because Peeta is not just important because he survives. He's one of the load-bearing walls of the entire trilogy. He's one of the Capitol's biggest tools against Katniss. He's the person they can threaten, torture, hijack, and use as bait. He's also absolutely essential in the Quarter Quell because he volunteers in Haymitch's place and becomes one of the core reasons Katniss gets pulled into the rebel rescue plan in the exact way that she does. So if Peeta dies in the 74th Hunger Games and Katniss comes out alone, this isn't just some small butterfly effect. It's going to change the entire trilogy, which makes it so fun to talk about. The first thing that I think would change is the image of Katniss herself. In canon, the Capitol survives the end of the 74th Hunger Games by reframing what happens. Katniss and Peeta don't just become victors, they become an entire love story. And that matters because the romance softens what would otherwise probably look like an act of rebellion. It gives the Capitol a way to package Katniss's defiance as emotional rather than political. The berries can be framed as an act of desperate love rather than an act of refusal to go along with what the Capitol wants, and we see this playing out in Catching Fire. If, however, she wins alone, that entire buffer becomes a lot weaker. Now, to be clear, the Capitol, I think, would still try to package her in some way. They might try to make her the grieving girl, the tragic volunteer, the poor young victor who lost the boy who loved her. So there's still a love story probably in some type of way. However, the love story is now dead on arrival. Because Peeta's no longer standing beside her, he can't smile for the cameras, he can't reinforce the narrative, he can't help her through the victory tour, he can't be used in interviews, proposals, victory tour performances, or Capitol propaganda in the same way. Now, the Capitol can use Peeta's memory, but it can't use Peeta himself, and I think that would terrify Snow. Because we've all seen Katniss, and I think solo victor Katniss would be a lot harder to contain. She looks less like one half of a romantic couple and much more like a symbol of naked survival. And let's not beat around the bush here. She was not the reason that the romance looked in any way or shape or form believable. That was very much all Peeta. She is harsher, more severe, more political, whether she means to be or not. And Katniss herself would also come home in a much worse emotional state because Peeta isn't just part of the public story. He's one of the only people who actually understands what the arena was with her. If she comes back alone, she definitely carries a lot more of that trauma by herself. Let's be real, she's not gonna lean on Haymitch for advice. And worse than that, she's also now carrying Peeta's death and probably feeling some guilt around that, alongside of course Rue's death. So I don't think she would be just sad. I think she would feel guilty. She would have even more PTSD because even before she fully understands her feelings for him, he matters too much to her for his death not to become one of the defining wounds of her life. So the immediate result most likely is this. The Capitol gets a victor it can't package as easily, and Katniss will become a lot more isolated much more quickly. That makes her a lot more dangerous, but also more breakable. I think one of the biggest consequences of this version, though, is that the Capitol loses one of its best tools. In canon, Peeta is one of the main ways that Snow manages to control Katniss. He can threaten him, punish him, display him, torture him, and eventually hijack him into a weapon against her. Katniss herself understands in Mockingjay that the Capitol's keeping Peeta alive because he is useful as leverage against her. If Peeta is dead after the 74th Hunger Games, that entire layer of leverage is gone. So who's going to Snow turn to instead? Prem. It's absolutely going to be Prim. Prim was always the deepest emotional center of Katniss's life. She volunteers for Prim in the first place, and everything starts there. And if Peeta is gone, then Prim becomes even more obviously the person in the capital that they use to threaten to control Katniss. But I do think Snow would have to be a little bit more careful about how he does this. He probably couldn't just openly threaten Prim in a way that then made the capital audience turn to him, because Katniss's love for Prim is part of what made her so sympathetic in the first place, and the capital really loves Prim as well. So the pressure would probably have to initially be indirect. Behave on the victory tour or District 12 suffers, stay useful or Prim's fragile protection disappears, smile for the camera or your family becomes less safe. And her mother matters too, and Gel matters as well, but Prim is the emotional weak point for Katniss. Prim is the person Katniss would burn the world down to protect. So I think in this version, Snow's strategy becomes even more naked. Instead of trying to manage Katniss through the illusion of romance and the threat of losing Peeta, the pressure becomes much more direct through her family and especially Prim. And that will have consequences on Katniss and her behavior, and it will change her because the capital's violence becomes less emotionally complicated and more brutally obvious. There's no living love story to hide behind. There's just coercion. And this might actually make Katniss politically sharper a lot sooner because there's less space for pretending the capital is merely cruel in a theatrical sense. It becomes openly sadistic and personal. And this is, of course, where the entire structure of the trilogy explodes. If we assume the capital does the same Quarter Quell rule, that tributes must be reaped from the existing pool of victors, then District 12's female victor is still Katniss, but without Peeta alive, the male victor can only be Haymitch. And that obviously is going to change everything because Peeta volunteering for Haymitch in canon matters enormously. It means Katniss goes into the arena with the person she's most emotionally tied to, and it helps shape not only her own motivations, but the entire rebel rescue plan around her. Without Peeta, Haymitch is going back in, and Haymitch going back into the arena is a completely different proposition. First of all, Katniss would be horrified. Haymitch is damaged and difficult and frustrating, but he's also one of the only people who truly understands what she has survived at this point. For Katniss, this wouldn't feel like being sent into the arena with someone she has to protect romantically. It would feel like being sent into the arena with maybe the only adult who ever taught her how to survive it. And that's very, very brutal. Haymitch isn't just another victor to her. He's a mentor. She has a liking to him. He's the person who already survived the capital once and was punished for it for the rest of his life. Sending him back into the arena would feel like the capital digging up a living wound just to punish them both. And of course, the rebel plan becomes a lot more complicated. In canon, the rebels inside the arena are trying to preserve Katniss because she is the symbol that they need. Peeta's presence also affects every emotional calculation around her. With Haymitch inside instead, the rebellion loses Peeta's volunteer moment, loses that layer of public heartbreak, and loses one of the cleanest ways of keeping Katniss emotionally engaged in the exact shape that they know how to. However, Haymitch being in the arena will do one fascinating thing. It probably makes the Rebel Alliance more strategic and less romantic from the start. Haymitch already knows a lot. He's experienced, cynical, and much more politically aware than Peeta probably was at that stage. If he physically is inside the Quarter Quell, he may be able to coordinate with rebels like Finnick, BT, Virus, and Johanna more actively, but he's also older. He's more damaged and more vulnerable physically than Peeta. So I think the rebels could still get Katniss out, but it becomes a lot riskier, and whether they manage to get Haymitch out is a whole nother question. Now they aren't preserving a pair, they're preserving Katniss and, if possible, Haymitch. And Haymitch is much more likely than Peeta to understand the pieces of what is happening and potentially improvise, which could help the rescue, but is also a lot more expendable to the rebellion than Peeta was emotionally and from a narrative perspective. And that is a brutal truth, but I think it is true, unfortunately. If the rescue goes badly, the rebels will still save Katniss first, and Haymitch may not make it out because the capital may not use him as leverage and save him instead. So let's say that the rebels do manage to extract Katniss from the Quarter Quell and get her to District 13. In canon, Peeta's capture by the capital becomes one of the main emotional hooks that keeps Katniss tied to the wall and vulnerable to Snow's manipulation. His interviews, his suffering, his hijacking, all of it works because the capital understands exactly how important Peeta is to her. Without Peeta, the capital still needs bait, and so again, they'll probably go to Prim. The capital would use anything connected to Katniss's guilt and sense of responsibility. Prim, obviously, her mother, Gale's family, District 12 refugees, the people she couldn't save, maybe even Haymitch if he survived the arena and was captured instead of rescued. And I think they'd probably use Peeta's memory, because the capital can't hijack Peeta's mind anymore, but it can hijack his image. It can turn him into propaganda. It can frame him as the boy Katniss failed to save, or the boy whose death proves how destructive she is, or the tragic lover whose memory the capital pretends to honor while using it to control her. That feels like something President Snow would 100% do. Snow has to get inside of Katniss's mind through grief, and I think most likely guilt, and District 12 itself. So Prim becomes not just a vulnerability, but the vulnerability. And that means that District 13 would also have to treat Prim as strategically essential much earlier on. She wouldn't just be Katniss's sister. She would have to be one of the core people Snow could use to destabilize the Mockingjay. And I think that that will create a much harsher version of Katniss in District 13. In canon, I think Katniss is pulled into a lot of different emotional directions from time to time. Peeta, Gale, Prim, Rebellion, Coin, Snow, all of it. But in this version, I think for her the emotional lines will be a lot simpler. She wants Prim safe, she wants Snow dead, she trusts nobody, and that probably makes her a lot less pliable for Coin as well. Coin can't use Peeta as part of the emotional machinery around Katniss. She gets a much more traumatized, more furious, less romantically distracted version of the Mockingjay, which is useful in some ways, but harder to manage in others, and Katniss is already very difficult to manage. So how's the rebellion going to overthrow the capital? I do think the rebellion still wins, but it will win very differently. Peeta is incredibly important in canon, but he's not the reason the rebellion exists. The rebellion is bigger than him. District 13, Plutarch, Beatty, Finnick, Joanna, Boggs, the districts in active revolt, all of that still exists, and Katniss is still the symbol that they need, and the capital is still rotten enough to fall. So I do think that Snow is overthrown, but I think the emotional shape of that overthrow gets darker and less hopeful throughout. In the original trilogy, Peeta represents a different moral center. He's one of the few people who consistently pulls Katniss towards life instead of mere survival. He's the person who insists that they not let the capital remake and reshape them completely. And without him, I think the whole moral balance around Katniss shifts. Peeta asks, how do we stay ourselves? But Gil asks, how do we win? Haymitch asks, how do we survive? Coin asks, how do I use you? And Snow asks, how do I break you? Without Peeta, that first question, how do we stay ourselves, becomes much quieter. And unfortunately, I think that's where Gale becomes more important. Without Peeta as the counterweight, Gale's worldview gains more ground. Gale is already the character more aligned with military logic, retaliation, and the idea that you defeat cruelty by become willing to do what the enemy fears. If Peeta is dead, there's a much less to pull Katniss away from that logic emotionally, which means she and Gale might grow closer during the war, yes, but not necessarily in a healthy way. They might become allies in rage rather than partners in healing, and that then of course makes Coin and her plan a lot more dangerous too, because Katniss eventually sees through Coin, partly because she's already learned through enormous pain what it means when war logic starts justifying everything. I do still think Katniss would probably recognize Coin's ruthlessness in this version, especially once civilian sacrifice tactics start surfacing, but she may reach that realization from a more bitter and more exhausted place. So the capital still falls, Snow still probably dies, Coin may still die too, because I think Katniss's instincts against being used are too strong to let Coin become a simple replacement tyrant, but the road there I think is a lot uglier. And then, of course, what kind of ending does Katniss get? Is Prim there? Does she get peace? And I think it's a really sad realization. I do think this version changes Katniss's ending profoundly. So let's start with Gale. Do I think she ends up with him? Maybe briefly, maybe situationally, maybe in the middle of the war, but ultimately, probably not. And the reason is that the deeper issue between Katniss and Gale was never just Peeta being there, as much as Gale tries to paint it like that. it was worldview. Gale increasingly becomes aligned with a form of war view and wartime that Katniss can't live with by the end, especially once strategies involve civilian casualties and weaponized traps. That fundamental divide still exists, whether Peeta is alive or not. So yes, without Peeta, Gale has more space in Katniss's emotional life, but I don't think he's her happy ending. Thank God. I think he's much more likely to become the person she nearly chooses because there is no one else, and then loses anyway because war changes them in an incompatible directions. So let's look at Prim, and that's a really painful question. Would Prim live? Honestly, I think there's a chance she might. Not because the universe simply trades Peeta for Prim. I don't think it's that neat. And I also don't think Prim is automatically safe in this timeline. If anything, she's differently endangered because Snow and Coin would both understand how important she is to Katniss. But Prim's death in canon depends on a very specific chain of events. It happens during the Capitol's final assault through the parachute bombs in a moment tied directly to the ruthless wartime logic that also destroys Gale and Katniss's bond. If the war unfolds differently, if Katniss is less emotionally scattered by Peeta's capture and the hijacking, if District 13 structures her role differently, if Snow targets her through Prim earlier, if battle dynamics shift, then there's at least a plausible chance that Prim is not placed in that exact same fatal position. I don't think her survival clearly is guaranteed, but I do think the alternate timeline gives her a better chance of survival. And so if Prim lives, that changes Katniss's ending more than any romance ever could, because the canonical ending is haunted by loss. Katniss survives, yes, but she survives after the one person she volunteered for in the first place that started this entire series is gone. If Prim lives in this version, then even if Katniss ends up alone romantically, which I think she does, to me personally, that always made more sense. Maybe I misunderstand her character, but I always saw her either ending up alone and just doing her own thing or being with Peeta, but I never saw her having kids. I never envisioned that for her. I know it's supposed to be a thing of like, it shows she's finally accepting that the world is clearly in a place where she can do that and things are better now. And I think that's what we're supposed to feel, but it just never sat right with me, never sat right with me. But so I think she ends up in a future where Prim's survival allows her to be less lonely in her ending and at least makes the journey that they've gone through feel worth it because she's been able to save the one person that kickstarted all of it. And that's, in a very quick summary, how I think the story would potentially play out. What do you think, though? Do you think that her winning on her own would still allow the rebellion to kickstart, would still allow her to become the Mockingjay? Or do you think the rebellion would completely lose that piece of momentum that it so desperately needed at that time? Let me know in the comments below. And as always, please consider subscribing. A whole bunch of you watching these videos aren't, and I love that you're checking in every now and again, but why not subscribe and see what I've got coming next week? That's all from me today, though. Please do let me know in the comments if there's anything else you want me to look at, especially if it's Hunger Games related. Such a Hunger Games nerd. Ugh, I'm so excited for the new movie. Anyway, until then, I'll see you in the next one.